다 가장 먼저 디코드 슈디어와 두제 동에 라고네 동에 공부를 송바 인세서 가장 먼저 디 슈디어와 다 가장 편지기 먼저 제시직 조사서와 두제 동에 라고네 동에 공부를 송바 인세기 제시직 조사로 봐.
Yesterday we were on that verse with conditioned suffering in mind, meditating on suffering was said, and so we went through one reason of why the Buddha spoke of meditating on conditioned suffering.
다양 셰바 디디직 갑초구면도 삼기요래. 딱 단다 남바상기비 둥여 공부 송바디 두지기 둥여를 공부 송기요래 스케제디셰. 다 두지기 둥에 공용도 가장 아주 치워드 땅 봐봐. 두지기 둥에 공용도 칸디스 공기요래 세기. 삼로 가르 땅기요래 스케제 시행인도 아니 디 렌데라 금생이 삼로 땅체. 금생식 데라 아니 레드 녀몽기 시행한젠다. 금생식라 가르래 예배 땡체를 세지 아니 닐링기 풍부디 예배 땡체봐. 둥이기 땡체봐. 어디 삼로 땅야 돼. 다 금생이도 와.
So then as a response to why the Buddha spoke of meditating on suffering, there were two reasons that were given, which is that the Buddha has spoken of meditating on suffering, keeping in mind that one is to meditate on the fact that the aggregates are the support of all faults, but not solely on that, also to meditate on the fact that the aggregates are conditioned because they are under the power of karma and afflictions.
다 디인데 다 두제 동에 라고네 동에 공부 송바이 슬라비용데 아니 두제기 동에 공단디 두제기 동에 공단디 예베텐 체베 차네 두제기 동에도 공바체 딘디 공메디 아니 타르발라 동에글로 좀 많이 베게 체도 티케소나 아니 담에 공발라 죽죽이 요바인데 티기 연라라 아니 송바레스 디 가장 편지기 시작하듯이.
So the way that this was, the way we saw it yesterday, was that seeing them as a basis for faults or as a support for faults then leads to understanding that they are conditioned or they are powered by karma and afflictions. And then when there is a clear understanding or there is like a strong realization that arises through meditating on this, then this allows the mind naturally to enter into meditation on selflessness. That was how we had seen it yesterday. That's one way of thinking about it.
다 단다 셰바 사와디나로 카리 디시 개규라나 되니 두지기 동요 고메디 예배 때 제바 점 하고의 체도 공기요 말이에요. 그래서 예배 때 체도 예배 때 임바 아니 셰바 대zam기 체도 공부 말이에요. 디가라 연주 가르 공기요라나 되니 리뉴기 샤완칭이 뭐 공기요래요.
So that's how to read it in the first way, where it says, does not refer, that like the teachings regarding meditating on suffering of the appropriate aggregates do not refer solely to realize them being the support of faults. That's one way to read it. The other way to read it is when the Buddha spoke of meditating on suffering, he did not mean that meditating on suffering is to meditate on them solely as being the basis for faults, but along with that, to realize suffering beyond just meditating on them as being a support for faults. It has also been spoken of, or the Buddha has said this, keeping in mind that what is to be actually cultivated is a meditation on the fact that they are under the power of karma and afflictions.
So that lengi shawan chengi 두지기 둥에 공부송게 요레스 따오나 레뉴기 샤완징기 두지기 둥에 디 삼로 땅발라 디 삼로 땅로 고바 카리 요레스 람나 디 고바 카릴라나 디기 고바 디 다음에 베 따와 또야기 치도 송게 요레스
Can you actually change one thing in your text? You see how it says teachings regarding meditating on the suffering of the appropriate aggregates do not refer solely to realizing them. Can you change that to solely to meditate on them being the support of faults? Teachings regarding meditating on the suffering of the appropriated aggregates do not refer solely to, is everyone here? Solely to, then change it, meditate on them being the support of faults. Instead of realize them, realize that they are the support of faults, meditate on them being the support of faults. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. No, my God, debalang at six this true shot. Come soon, I think it tata gurmendo, tanda t-shirt.
Nyelengi pungbo deba. Nyelengi pungbo dungidu gombar sungba ni nyebe ten samshi gombar sungba mayinki. Linyugi shawanchingi dujigi dungidu gombar sungba yins.
Yes. So is that okay now? Teachings regarding meditating on the suffering of the appropriated aggregates do not refer solely to meditate on them being the support of faults. Instead, they were taught for one to meditate on the conditioned suffering that is under the power of karma and afflictions. So, when the Buddha said meditate on suffering, this way of other way of reading it is, it was not to refer solely on meditating on them being the support of faults, but for one to meditate on the fact that they are under the power of karma and afflictions. That's the meaning. Then, if one asks what is the purpose of talking about or meditating on them being under the power of karma and afflictions, is because this meditation on them being under the power of karma and afflictions leads to realizing selflessness. That's the other way to read this. And so this way of reading it, then if you carry on with the commentary, it's clear. The purpose of this, meditating on them being under the power of karma and afflictions, the purpose of this is because the mind that meditates on the contaminated aggregates, being under the power of karma and afflictions, is the basis that will give rise to the view that realizes no self.
Di dame to be tawa ke be ten dang khare res la ba ina ngegi nyelengi phungbo tenyas to nangba ngegi sit nangba sangi bi lugla ani nyelengi phungbo tenya jiri gyugengi chebe mitaba dans cheda do linyi gi kebe dungye wa sherna ani dende tela takba da changwa da dewe rangshin gi da mebar thongne sibale tho gyu yinos.
And carrying on, moreover, if we over here refers to the Buddhists, if we Buddhists know suffering by realizing that our appropriated aggregates, so now tied to oneself, are produced generally by causes and conditions, and more specifically by karma and afflictions, one will see that there is no self that has the nature of being permanent, pure, or of happiness, and this will lead to freedom from existence.
다 공부 도시에 나오래. 다 다음에 똑배. 다음에 뭐 똑발라. 다음에 똑발라 가르래. 풍불리 셴도 아니 ngobo직 매와 가장가서 계제셔바나 신시지 풍불리 셴도 주변 ngobo직 매바디 ngobo 간티지만 풍봉안나로 추당 가장가서 송만나 신도 공부시 당보되라.
So this way of, the one way of thinking about this part is, when you're thinking about selflessness, when you think that there is a self that is distinct from the aggregates, then to think about whether such a thing is possible or not, the way we discussed it earlier was trying to see whether there is any way for this self that we conceive of to fit, does such a self fit into one of these aggregates or not? So when one thinks of the self, do we feel that that self fits into one of the aggregates? That's one way of thinking about selflessness or the self.
So ta ngobo kandeji man ti phungbo ngabo nalo do sudro ba yindi ta phungbo ngabo tele shendu kyurba ngobo ji keje shega chimba yina dende di takbe keje takwa thedroyaj mado dosameba rigbadi to tenapab.
So if when one thinks like this and one finds that everything that one can conceive of either fits or does not fit into one of the five aggregates, and here thing we're referring to things that perform functions, so functional things. If everything fits into the five aggregates, or if it doesn't fit into the five aggregates, when you feel that there is something that is functional that does not fit into one of these five aggregates, then you end up with a necessary position that there is something that is functional and at the same time is not permanent.
So the tadile yundi nganzu hingi gilola hingi la ani hingi gilo tela kap chigla ngadi khadu yin gyuwa meba sheje takbe nashin gyuwa meba shidu yedinge nawa chikshar kap chigla dinde ngadi gi lega yang chigi yob namba chikshar reswa ta lega chigi yob namba chikshar ya 중두니 제 단답하도 가뒤 넣고 여여 뭐 유함에 버터도 여댕에 서로 나와지 니 샤용도 아니 유함에 버시제 도시 여바텔라 아니 리비 너바타 딱과 임바데도 자와체바니 긴두기 너바타 윤디 딱과 임바데 파까 ngobo 임바데 계제 셰윤디 자와체바 디가니 계제 셰윤디 아니 풍보마도 로사메데버시 풍보마도 로사메데버시 So the Pungbo Modu Dosa Medeva Indu, and Pungbo Inchinjela, Gudu King Wangi Kegoejina, Guru Ranshina, called Madu Dosa Medeva, Dikiji Shiva Tone, and it Dakandar, Pungbo Lutension with Dameba, Pumbo Ram Dama in Basa, you call it Letrosta.
So often when you think of yourself, or one thinks of a self, but of oneself, one feature that always accompanies this perception of oneself is that it is kind of it's always been there and it's always been the same one. So it's accompanied with this idea that it's some sort of unchanging, unaltered self that has carried on. Simultaneously, another way that it is conceived of is as something that is doing things or it's acting. So it also it's perceived or conceived of with some sort of agency. When these two features are clear, then at that point you can analyze these two features and see how they contradict each other. So you can use reasoning to show how these two aspects, one that it remains unchanged and unaltered, while at the same time performing functions, these two are contradictory. So you use whatever reasoning you've done up until now to show how these two things cannot exist simultaneously. And so when you show that there's a contradiction between these two aspects, one of doing things and the other one of being unchanging, then you end up negating that aspect of it being permanent. If you negate that aspect of it being permanent, you end up showing that it has to be impermanent, and at that point, naturally, it will fit into one of the aggregates. You will find that it is that idea of it being something distinct or a separate substance from those five aggregates, that gets refuted. At that point, you end up refuting that, one, there is a self that is separate from the aggregates, that is permanent and has a sense of agency, which is the aspect of empty. And you also refute that the aggregates themselves have this sort of permanent, unchanging agency, and so you refute that the aggregates are the self. And so by this reasoning, you get both the aspect of selfless and the aspect of empty.
So that Pungbole tension be dagi tongwa. Pungbole tension be dagi tongwa tedang. Ani Pungbo tedabu rawan with dadi maimba. Sketch gudu, Pungbo tedabu rawan with dadi maimbe, Drubjetela. Pungbo di midabare to was. Rawan daina, Dagwayanko to was. Reswa. Pungbo di led the Numongi Shawanjere to was. Gui Shawanjere to was. Tedabu rawan daina, Gui Shawanjan Shatu mid was. Pungbo di Mizan Ranshin red was. 다 라와웨 다이나 디짱웨 랑신 게제 셰로도 와서 풍부디나 아니 동이웨 랑신레도 와서 라와웨 다디나 아니 데웨 랑신레도 와서 소자 디인디 라와웨 다데다 풍부니부디기 신이 뱃 미팅부 차소 신이 가리 미팅부 차르스나 라와웨 다디나 딱바 인고야 짱와 인고야 데웨 랑신 인고야 풍부 인소나 미다바 인고야 동여바 인고야 미장와 인고야 소자 팅이 미tumba 차바 인디 풍부디 다레민도 스케제 셰드르와 소자다 풍부디 대답을 하면 다 마인바 똑바디 가르레 다메 똑바드르와 디 인디 대답을 다메 똑발라 풍부디 미다바 인바다 동여바 규징기 샤완제 규레드 녀몽게 샤완제 인바디 셰고에디 디 셰바이나 따와디 또에게 중진디 디레 차소와 디 인디 가르차바레 풍부 미다바 가자 풍부 동녀모 고메디 풍부 레드 녀몽게 샤완진이 뭐 고메디 딘디기 다음에 풍부디 다마인 뭐 또야기 체도 풍부디 다마인 뭐 또비 따와기 땡차데 버레스 어디 숨게 규차디고 버레스.
So of these two, which is empty and selfless, empty is that the aggregates are empty of a separate self, a separate autonomous self. And the selfless one, if you remember, is that the aggregates themselves are not an autonomous self. Of these two, the second one, which is the aggregates are not an autonomous self, the reason, if you remember, was the aggregates are not an autonomous self because they are impermanent and they are under the power of causes and conditions that are karma and afflictions. So when you understand or when you know that the aggregates are impermanent, and they have causes, and those causes are karma and afflictions, then there immediately comes to be a contradiction between the aggregates being an autonomous self, because what you realize at that point is the aggregates are impermanent. Were there an autonomous self, it would have to be permanent, but these cannot have a common locus, or they cannot be something that's both, because the aggregates themselves are impermanent. So you refute the possibility of there being a permanent self, or them having the nature of a permanent self. Then the idea that the aggregates are, so here you find pure, but it's the same as clean. Often in English you'll find clean. So the idea that the aggregates can be an autonomous self gets further negated when you realize that the nature of the aggregates is impure, but if they were of the nature of an autonomous self, they would have a pure or clean nature. And so you also refute that possibility. Then when you understand that because you have understood, not when you understand, because you've already understood that the aggregates are under the power of karma and afflictions, you realize that they have the nature of suffering. And because they have the nature of suffering, they cannot be the nature of an autonomous self, because were there to be an autonomous self, that would have a nature of being happy, or if its nature would be one of happiness or bliss or whatever pleasure, whatever you want to call that. And so when you see this contradiction, that the aggregates are not an autonomous self, because they are impermanent, they are impure, and they are the nature of suffering, and if there were a self, it would have to be permanent, pure, and of the nature of happiness. Then you realize that there is a direct contradiction between the qualities that the aggregates have and the qualities that the self would have to have, and by doing this, you negate the aggregates having the nature of this autonomous self, and you come to the realization of selfless, that aspect of selfless, of the truth of suffering. And because this has arisen, or this, what made you understand this, or the realization of this aspect of selfless, arose from understanding the nature of suffering and the nature of impermanence of the aggregates. It says meditating on suffering and meditating on impermanence has the purpose of giving rise to, or it's what allows for the view of selflessness to arise. So it's what permits for knowing, realizing selflessness. So that's what the verse says when it says, Moreover, ours arise from conditions. That is the basis of the view of no self.
다 디치디 가르쳐서 다 셰바니 차서와 셰바니 레서와 셰바직디 가르레 둥이 곰버 송베 고바 가르레 라나 규민지기 체도레스 시발리 트레베 체도 마레 규민지기 체도레스 시발리 트레베 람 다메도 셰라마도 요 마레스 디기 규민제 되라 아니 둥이 곰버 송레스 가상간족이 셰바디체 디자와 가르기 땡기 요래 똥니 따위 트규 똥니 따위 트로바교 곰바하마 대등인 세기 고와디체 가상게 셰바 당보디 고와디 디 똥니 따위 트규 곰바하마 대등인 세 송게디체.
So now there's these two explanations that we've seen. The first one that we saw yesterday was how all of these other aspects which are not selflessness, for instance, the aspect of impermanence and suffering, those are ripening paths, if you remember. Those are paths that ripen, allow for the path that liberates, which is solely the view of selflessness or the wisdom of selflessness. That is only the only liberating path is that. All these other ones are ripening paths. And so the first way of understanding this is the reason why the Buddha said or taught suffering or instructed one to meditate on suffering was because those are ripening paths. The only path that is a liberating path is the wisdom of selflessness. And this fact comes up in the next two lines of the root verses, which are the view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose. So this fact of there being only one liberating path and all the others have been taught for the purpose of ripening that is explained in these two lines. The view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose.
다 동의 공부를 숨비 고바 셴바디 카레라나 동의 공부를 숨비 고바 셴바디 다메비 따와께 비치도 숨비요레스.
And then the second way of reading it, which is what we're doing this morning, is the view of selflessness and the meditations on suffering. The second way of explaining it is the meditations on suffering give rise to the view of selflessness. And this fact of how meditating on suffering gives rise to the view of selflessness is explained in these last two lines, which is, therefore it was taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering comes no self. And that's also this one, moreover ours arise from conditions, that is the basis of the view of no self.
다 카세우치네 삼 고대우 쳬바 이나다 카세우 계제 쳬바 이나 남바수 공부 된리치 당고델라 남바상게비 둥이 공부 송바디 카리레 지바땅나 랭카리자가 지도기 렌디 카리자가.
So just to make it easier without getting into detail, if someone was to ask generally, right, what is the purpose of meditating on suffering that has been taught by the Buddha? What would the answer be as a general answer, without getting into all this detail? What would the answer for that be?
What's the question? The purpose?
Yeah.
To realize selflessness.
purpose lamida dungi gombar su dungi nangba sangi bi dungi gombar sungye gi dungi di kharire.
Oh, sorry. What is the suffering that is being spoken of? The suffering to be meditated on. What is that suffering?
Didi soa. Ta dujigi dungi la khariyore. Duje dungi gomdan de la khajoyo chibatana.
And if one says, how many ways of meditating on all-pervasive suffering are there?
Ni kare.
What are they?
Nyebe ten dan kare.
What was the other one? Base of false and?
Nyebe ten ba dan linyo gi shawan jin ba. Dini tuwa. Dini chaswa. Ta tuwa yangger tuwa. Ta nyebe ten gome di goba kare res.
And what is the purpose of meditating on them as being the support of faults?
Because of the evidence and the nature of suffering?
Dungegi rangshin sheba.
아.
Dungegi rangshin sheba.
디자 코란 동에 고메 코란 대가나 봐.
That's part of meditating, that the nature of suffering.
To generate an uncontrolled wish to be free from samsara.
Orole thalu jumu mai bakiya baasa.
가장가서 계좌시 랜드래. 그래서 가장가서 가리시에래. 예배된 고메데 가리체도래.
What did we say yesterday? The purpose of meditating on them being the faults of, the basis of faults is, or the support of all faults?
To realize it and then look for the causes.
Koshin gyutselwa.
아. 다른데 딜라고 했다. 예배된 코란라 벳셀도 되는 곰기야 고바디.
So the question is, what is the point of single-pointedly focusing or like expressly meditating on them being the basis of faults? Thardu choma mein bakiya baasa.
손자 가장가서 계좌 가리시에래. 타르바 dünyagillo choma ma yimba kiye gichedo 곰기 요레스 가장가서 계좌디 시엠바. 다 타르바 dünyagillo choma ma yimba kiye chedo 디 곰기 요레스. 타바 dünyagillo choma ma yimba 디 마게나 타르바로 dünyagillo 랑기 ngagi kiye 디 마충바 이나 가장가서 같이 계좌 가르총래. 다음에 곰바디 용구마 다음에라 뭐 düny 쪼와되는 곰바디 용구를 베서나 용구마레스. 가장가서 디 시엠바. 디 인도다 타바 dünyagillo choma ma yimba kiye 타바 dünyagillo choma ma yimba 디 계소나 아니 다음에 곰발라 죽주야 다음에 곰발라 랑기 ngagi 죽주야디 레소와 죽주야 저러와 디니 디 차자 용사디 가완데 lep소 둥이기 풍부디 예베 땡이 삼로 땅데 디 델라다 곰 델라 무튼 곰자에 디기 디치기 여러와 디 인도 가르쳐버래 타바 dünyagillo choma ma yimba kiye 인디 타르발라 가리기 끼기레스 라바이나 다메 또비 셰럽디기 끼기레스 그래서 다 다메 또비 셰럽 곰니 타르발레 깨와 제발라 왜라 타바 dünyagillo choma ma yimba 깨구고 여바 인디 디 가리기 수그래 단다 예베 땡 셰바 삼로 땅와 디기 아니 수그레스 디 인디 가레레 동니 따베 죄규와 줄 곰바 하마 대된이스 소자 동니 따와데 죄제게 람디 민제게 람스 어디 도스티시자
계산은 예배된 집을 쓴 거를 두지기 등에 집을 쓴
예배된 집.
So meditating on the fact that it is that it is the basis of or the support of all faults was for generating that uncontrived wish to attain liberation, because if there is no uncontrived wish for liberation, then there is no effort in trying to cultivate, first realize and then cultivate the view of selflessness. So without an uncontrived wish for liberation, there is no meditating on selflessness. Because selflessness is the antidote to attain or remove the obstacles to attain liberation, or realization of selflessness is what leads to attain liberation. The view of selflessness is the only liberating path, and everything else that is explained, the remaining meditations are for this purpose, means that all other meditations are ripening paths that lead to generating or that ripen the liberating path, which is the wisdom of selflessness. And so over here, reflecting on it being the aggregates being the basis or the support of all faults, the support of all suffering, is that ripening path that generates the uncontrived wish to attain liberation, which then acts as the liberating path for cultivating selflessness.
디딕송아 단다 디 자와 가리기 때문에라나 돈이 따위 줘가 줄 곰발하마 대된인스.
So this is the explanation of the view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose.
디딕송아 다디 티와 단다 디딕송아 다 둥이 곰다 니버디 리뉴기 샤완체 다 리뉴기 샤완체 임바 둥이 리뉴기 샤완체 임바 곰야드르다 땡라 파베드 마르다 땡라 팝산데 대가랑라 메디테치 곰야디 고바 가리레
So then the second aspect of the suffering, or the second part of suffering, which is under the power of or under the control of karma and afflictions. So not realizing this, I think. It's not to realize this, it's to focus on it, like meditate on this aspect. What is that for?
소자다 리뉴기 샤와진이부 풍부 리뉴기 샤와진이부 때나 팝차위 제라 디간에 양내 삼로 땅제도 삼로 땅에도 거바 가리yor라나 풍부디 라와에 다 마임바 그래서 풍부 라와에 다 가야기 거바 디체도 다디 자와 가리기 때문에 자와 때디 니게 태야 깽리게 되네 다음에 따데인스 디지르미다 레둥 둥엘렌 다음에 손스.
So this one, when, like, so now again, it's not to realize it, but to meditate on it. The purpose of meditating on the second part of suffering, which is that it is under the power of karma and afflictions, is that as you cultivate this meditation, it gives rise to an understanding that the aggregates are not of the nature of a self. And understanding that the aggregates are not of the nature of a self gives rise to the view of no self. And so here, where in the in the verses you find this part being explained, it's the third and the fourth line, which is, moreover, ours arise from conditions. This is the view of no self. And then the last two lines, which is, therefore it was taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering comes no self.
Dungi samlotangeda dungi samlotang goba di dame betawa dame mato ba to bichedo sunye gi goba chik di chedo dungi du samlotang goba chik reswa goba chik di kharere dame bala gome gi chedo dame ba to sane dame bala mutune gome gi chedo lo juge gi chedo dungi gomba sunye chik ni goba ni di res.
So the two purposes for why the Buddha taught the Buddha taught meditation on suffering, or the Buddha urged one to meditate on suffering. The first one was to give rise to a view of no self that was earlier not there. So to newly give rise to the view of selflessness is one purpose of meditating on suffering. The other purpose of meditating on suffering is to sustain the meditation on selflessness once that has been realized. So there's two. The first one is to give rise to the view of selflessness, and the second one is to ensure that that view of selflessness, then one sustains that by continually meditating on that. Those are the two purposes of teaching suffering, or teaching or urging people to meditate on suffering.
Duje dunge lagone dunge gomba sungba yins dije la ngegi the kenle kese de mala bache duje dunge lagone dunge gomba sungba yins an jumzen khare toni tawe thoju ju gomba lama de de tijir mida le dunge len dame songs sawa dus kyona kimani de ma tenju dus kyona sheba thangbu gi goba tiche ta yan duje dunge lagone al thangbu dilada.
So just pay attention to this. One way, like to make this clear, how you can read these verses is you take them as they are, but you remove the third and the fourth line. Okay? So if you remove the third and the fourth line and you read it together, then it becomes, with conditioned suffering in mind, meditating on suffering was said, the view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose. Therefore it was taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering comes no self. This is that second way of understanding it, right? Which was the purpose of meditating on suffering was because it is a ripening path that strengthens or makes that meditation on selflessness stronger. So that's one way of reading it.
Tatini, that sigang ngawa the tubani de mate. Kaza, sigang tangu niva cherwa, sumba shiva ngawa tuba de mate. Ngawa tuba de tanda sumba shiva de mate in loimba, sheba tangu de she. 다 sheba nipa di che yundu duje dungye lagone dungye gombar sungba yins. Ani tene nyegi tenya kenleke tene dame taden yins. Ani tongi tawa toyu gomba lama tene se dingi di ma tuen che sharja tijir mida le dungye le dame sung slamna sheba chimadi.
그럼 막 kewa cheba 들어가게.
Dame toyeg chedo.
So if you get rid of, if you just remove the, fifth and sixth lines, the view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose. If you remove these two and you read it, with conditioned suffering in mind, meditating on suffering was said, moreover, so now you have this third and the fourth, moreover, ours arise from conditions, that is the basis of the view of no self. Therefore, it was taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering comes no self. This way of understanding, or this way of reading them, is the explanation of how meditating on suffering gives rise to the view of selflessness. Is that clear?
그래서 당보 지강 숨바의 시원이의 마트엔시 안 도슬로바이나 디 두제기 둥이 곰버송베 둥이 곰버송와디 두제기 둥이라고 두제 둥이 곰버송베 고바 카리레스나 고바 당보디 그래서 어디 고바 당보 원도 신께 제시인디 지강 숨바의 시원이의 마트엔이 도스신 삼 당기 셰바 당보디 공디셰 아니 다 셰바 치마게 원도 제인디 아니 동이 답에 되주 공부 라마 되는세 찍디 마트 디 마트엔시 셴바디 마두스 자바이나 어다 도시 차다.
So in the first way of doing it is by removing the third and the fourth line, which says the purpose of meditating on suffering was to meditate on conditioned suffering, and that has the purpose of ripening, because the view of emptiness is the one that liberates, so it strengthens that realization or that meditation on selflessness. The other one is where you remove the fifth and the sixth. The fifth and the sixth lines, and then you read it like that, and there it's explaining how meditating on suffering gives rise to the view of selflessness.
Didixwa ta duje dunge lagone dunge gombar songbayin duje dunge lagongne se di chigdi duje dunge lagongne se chigdi malabache reswa ta duje dunge de la tangi shedegi ni ge je sheje nyebe ten gomya chigda ani linyo ge shangwaji gomba ni yorwa ni yoba yindu ta tango de la nyebe ten la nyebe ten she phungbo nyebe ten la gongne dunge gombar songbate 아니 가리기 줌쟁 가리기래라나 아니 동이 따베 뒤주 공발 하면 되더니 디지르미달레 등 동엘는 다음에 송 찍딜 마차 릭소마 다 리뉴기 샤완진 세기 텔레게제 셰인데 리뉴기 샤완진 두지기 동의 공바 텔라 공네 아니 동의 공바 송바 리뉴 샤완진 공네 동의 공바 송바디 가리래라나 얘기 돼야 깨내게 되는 다음에 따대인스 디지르미달레 등 동엘는 다음에 송세제 독스 낭세라 예원이 독스 체제 두제 등의 코란 낭세가 예원이 체제 소소소다 자르니 셰바 잡초르다.
So then just keep paying attention. In the first line which says with conditioned suffering in mind, now instead of reading it as conditioned suffering in general, because conditioned suffering has two meanings, or is further explained in two ways, which is it is the basis for, it is the support of faults, and it is under the power of karma and afflictions. The first way of reading it, where we had removed the third and the fourth line, in that version, when it says conditioned suffering, remove conditioned suffering and put with it being the support of all faults in mind, meditating on suffering was said. The view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose. Therefore, it was taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering comes no self. Is that clear? Right? So when you put that, then that aspect of conditioned suffering, which is the part of it being the support of all faults, is the ripening path that strengthens the wish to attain liberation, that then strengthens the meditation on selflessness. Is that okay? Now the second way of dividing the verses, where we had removed the fifth and the sixth line, when you look at the first line of that, remove conditioned suffering, and you can put with aggregates, with the aggregates that are powered by karma and afflictions in mind, meditating on suffering was said. Then you don't have the third and the fourth line. The view of emptiness, then you have the third and the fourth line. Moreover, ours arise from conditions. That is the basis of the view of no self. You don't have the next two lines, and then, therefore, it was taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering comes no self. So this way of reading it is to show how meditating on the fact that the aggregates are under the power of karma and afflictions, which is the third line, ours arise from conditions, that is the basis of the view of no self, which gives rise to the view of no self. Therefore, it was taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering comes no self. So this is another way in which you can take these verses and you can understand them like that. They can also be explained like this. Is this clear, or are you kind of confused?
This way. Odrishata. That tanda jeba di losarwa. That tanda ngi jeba di nanglola. Tanda ngi jeba di nanglola kariti islamna. Sheba chime odrishinya. Tongi tawe tuju yu gombal hama tedin seegi digi sheba di ngi di tiyo mare. Tanda ngi zo sheba di kariti islamna ngi te genle ki tenen dame taden yese digi sheba odrishinya ngi sheba di tiyo.
So in the commentary, the way I have written the commentary is not keeping in mind the view of emptiness, the way of explaining it, which is the view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose. But I have given this, like the commentary has been written, keeping in mind how it gives rise to the view of emptiness, which is, moreover, ours arise from conditions, that is the basis of the view of no self.
So that di tsawa digi tunda madus chig shungla madus je yong badang dini khare sogore chig yongra chine da sheba di khandire slaba ina mang chewa jigi tongi tawe thöju yu gombal hama thedin di sheba di yongra chini shedigidu di indi ni sheba di thanda di koyo mare.
The reason why I haven't given this other version, which is meditating on selflessness, emptiness liberates, the view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose, is because normally when you look at how it's most commonly commented on or how it's most commonly explained, you find that the emphasis is predominantly on these two lines, which is the view of emptiness liberates, and remaining meditations are for this purpose. So because this is commonly available, and you will find this in the various commentaries, this seems to be the predominant explanation. I haven't put that in this commentary.
So that nyegi te kenlegi tene dame taden yense di sheba wandu chebe sheba dis kumbo robsto.
So this way of explaining it through moreover ours arise from conditions, that is the basis of the view of no self. I wonder if maybe in English if you put a comma after that, then it kind of reads together. Moreover, ours arise from conditions, comma, that is the basis of view of no self. They get combined as like two lines, if it helps you. This way of focusing on this presentation is a little more rare.
And then how about do nyelengi pungbu dungye du gomba tela nyebe ten kome de linye ge shawanji ge duje ge dungye du gomba dinye la sosor cheje du samodana yoba di sheba di ta thungi kumbu do resha.
And then also taking conditioned suffering and then dividing it into two, the way we have done, which is one is the basis or the support of faults, and the other one is it is powered by karma and afflictions, and then explaining these two aspects is also not very common. It's not very common.
That those in sheba gemna da ngaran samot dus korgu yor da sheba nigal da dus kaga machene jidone samotana dishe ge da yung chogore de su dus pa che yung de lola bang ju buji da lola de char de buji kebar buji do so da sheba dendi gyaba ne yagudu samchi di ko burti ngi de ina da sheba dendi gyab chogu yumi mishi da yung nalani yo mara da di dus thanda de nyebe ten samchi gombar sungo ma lenying shawanji gu duji gu dungen gombar sungba yin se ge ani ma tuga ge de dusre ta ina di samju di gena la phusha.
this way of dividing it and thinking about it, when I do it, when I read it, of course there's a general way that you can understand the verses, but breaking it up in this way, I find it a little helpful for myself, and so that's why I've done it over here. I can't claim that this is accurate, but I find this helpful or relevant, and so I've offered this way of thinking about it by separating conditioned suffering into two and then dividing the verses in different ways. I find this helpful when I think about it, and so please don't necessarily consider this to be correct. I've shared this because I find it relevant, and I've also offered it to my teacher.
So that gengi see me mishirwa in a cousin gela the sixto naronas and shaba gena norina jis songranas did purwa and gengi did some digic shares. Magi Odisa loving cholang nearwa. Well, Magi Maji change Dawaji is Magil Desia and Kirandi Chikon Shitatashes.
When I asked Gela to look at it and see if there's anything wrong with what I've written or if this explanation works or not, I don't know if Gela has actually read it or gone through it, but what he said is before you kind of finalize this, since Odisha is where Acharya Dignaga is from, go to Odisha where Acharya Dignaga lived and spend a month again trying to contemplate and reflect on these verses.
Oh, so. Oda di chaso da. Dungyo gombar songa gyawa pangay di chaso.
So this is now, we finished this subdivision, which was showing contradictions with the Buddha's teachings on suffering.
So that di inji ki subject dinga zo karil keje shere sana di inji sangma nga zo doling kari gang doling chedere lana dala chakwa dila khabde khandis chagi imba dagi wala chakwa la khabde khandis chagi imba sa tirta.
So all of this, what we have gone through so far, was addressing or was kind of regarding the questions about how one can counter or one can remove attachment to the self and attachment to mind.
Tirwa ta dishidi ta ko sumgala jachu sarwa dala chakwa dagi wala chakwa ani yu chirugi yula chakwa ta jisu sangmala kapde khandis chagi se direta chakwa dela kapde khandis chagi in se gita digala nga zo rolling chigi yorta.
So what we're discussing is how you remove attachment to the self, to mind, and you can easily add to this also how you remove attachment to external things. So what's being addressed here is how do you remove attachment to things, to mind, and to the self.
Ta dela chakwa dela kapde jadang dela dangbo dela dosa nima tu yomari. Chikdi kare dala chakwa dagi wala chakwa yula chakwa khandiji yinba yena chakwa digi shingyu meba tenla pamne chakwa digi shingyu mindu chakwa di chinchu logu loresha se keja di shebe tone kapde chaye chik dangbo di diri.
So there's two presentations that you've come across. One is whatever form of attachment it is, whether it's to the self, to mind, and to things, the antidote is realizing that their objects, the objects they engage in, do not exist. So by refuting that their objects of engagement exist, one is cultivating antidotes to all three. So that's the first way of explaining.
Ta nibadi karere chakwa digi shingyu semen meba kanya mebe tone kama tuba tagara yebe tone ani chakwa dela nyembo khandis tengas nyembo tengi tap segi ta di nima tu dosa yomari.
The other version is without refuting or without analyzing whether the object exists or not, so leaving the object untouched is there any way to remove attachment? These are the only two options that are available. One is you counter the object, or you address the object and see whether it exists or not, and then you refute the object. Or the second one is you leave the object untouched, and then you try and find another way to remove attachment. These are the only two options.
딩이 모두로 서면도와 딩이 모두로 서면시 타쇼 다 가령 아주 심주체고래라나 심주체디 착바디기 신유 매바 땡라 팝네 착바기 님부 땡바 텔라 착바 짬에 소야기 고급디 시기도 시기민도세 직체 착바기 신유 매바 체메 까투야 요 말레스 까투야 요 말에디 이나야 착바 짬에 소야 시기리 시기 말레스 다 착바 짬에 소야디 딩이기 나니 가리를 시기 말해 디 심주체다.
So what we're okay, so like the fact that it has to be one of these two, we have to be sure of, right? You have to be sure that it's either this or this, there's no other way. Then the next question is, what we're checking later is to remove attachment. And here to remove attachment, we mean to definitively remove. So like to eliminate, uproot attachment. Is this possible without refuting the object or without realizing that the object does not exist? In the sense that if you realize that the object does not exist, does this have the ability to uproot attachment? Or without engaging in the object and just working on the attachment itself, is it possible to uproot attachment entirely? So that's what you're checking. Which one of these alternatives can actually lead to uprooting attachment?
그래서 소다 차고 짬에 소야디 가리를 시바레샤스 그래서 신유 순충외 신유 순충샤와 텔라 시기레 신유 수마총 님보 템바 텔라 시기레 딩이는 찍을 시기레 간들 시기르다 딕제바체체 다 딕제바 나체 신유 순충나마도 셴바 님보 가져 템바 이나 디 짬에 소베 시기 민두 세기 삼루직 레소나
If you, through your own reflections, find that amongst these two versions, the only one that can definitively remove attachment is only when you realize that its object does not exist, and that's the only way in which you can definitively remove attachment. So it's not lowering, it's removing, uprooting entirely. Then that view aligns with the Buddhist view.
다 신유 순충투의 민두, 신유 체메가투의 민두, 신유 여바 샤고그레 이나양 아니 차과디 잠에서 바지 시사레세 계저 삼루지 코바이나 어디 치료비 따와들.
If your reflections lead you to feel that or believe that the object of attachment cannot be harmed, or it's not, there's no need to address that, and that there are other alternatives that can completely eradicate attachment without harming its object, then if that's what you find yourself, your reflections leading you to, then you align with the non-Buddhist view. So the view of the non-Buddhists who do speak of liberation. So if you find, however, that you are neither convinced that you can remove or refute the object, nor are you convinced that there are other means to overcome attachment, and that attachment is somehow like an inherent quality of the mind, or it's an inherent human quality, then you align, your views align with those of the non-Buddhists who do not accept liberation, nor do you align with the view of the Buddhists, because accepting that you can't refute the object means it's not the Buddhist view. That attachment cannot be removed means it's not the non-Buddhist view of those who speak of liberation. And so that's the third view, which is liberation is not possible. Attachment is inevitable.
디치도 다 가르쳐서 타르바 켈링이 낭바직 타르바 켈링이 치료바직 타르베 남샤 켈 밀링이 치료바직 숨차서 어디르다.
So there's three views. The first one is the view that liberation is possible, the way it's explained by the Buddhists, the view that liberation is possible explained by the non-Buddhists, and the view that liberation is not possible, which is also the non-Buddhist view. So there's these three alternatives.
So that 낭바기 가르셔디고 오래 탄다보도 셰디에 디기 신윤순 충마토나 신윤가 마토나 아니 차그리시기 말이 낭바 디셰디 니바 디기 신윤마가나야 차그리시기레 딜랍들 숨바 디기 신윤가 토에민도 탑람 셴바 가레템바 이나야 차과도 쳐바디 시기민도 디인도코 차과 내가 미기워서 지에기 고급점심 마도 땐도 매가스에 미시버리스 세기 계제 디감도 됐다.
So the first view of the Buddhists is, without refuting its object, you cannot remove attachment, but if you can refute the object, you can definitively uproot attachment. The second one, which is the non-Buddhist view that speaks of liberation, is saying you cannot refute the object is there, but there are other means that you can use to uproot attachment entirely. And the third view is saying whatever you do, you can't refute the object and you cannot remove attachment entirely. All you can do is find moments to quell heightened states of attachment or have little pauses from it, but you cannot definitively remove it.
딕스와 다 디윤도 다 타르바케 링킹기 치료바디기 신유 마가베 토네 차디 시기리 세게 차디 시비 컨디션 시기리스 다 차디 시기요나 아니 차과디 본지기 님보 가리요레스도 가장 님보 니셰데들.
So when the non-Buddhists say you can overcome attachment without addressing the self, and then the question was asked, what are the various ways in which you can do that? What antidotes can you use without removing or refuting the object, its object? There were these two views or two methods that were spoken of.
So that 니디 가르셔버래.
Do you remember what those two methods were?
Reflecting on the faults of attachment to self, reflecting on the faults of attachment.
차과는 예믹 삼로 땅에 직 달라 계제시에 윤디 차과는 예믹 삼로 땅에 마도 달라 예믹 삼로 땅에 매워체 더기와를 계제시에 윤디 차과점 마이버 더기와 코로나 예믹 삼로 땅에 딩이디.
So if you remember, it was when it's attachment to the self, then there's no faults with the self, it's only faults with attachment. When it's attachment to mind, then not only are there faults with mind, but there are also some defects with not just with the attachment to mind, but with the mind itself, what is identified as mind. And so reflecting on the faults of both. So the two methods will be reflecting on the faults of attachment and reflecting on the faults of mind, that which belongs to the self. Is that clear?
올라서 다 싸워직 시에고다야 답람 싸워직 시루버심바지기야.
So now there's a new that's separate antidote that is being spoken of by them.
대신 가버려라나 대신 이베들에 타르바 켈링이 치루바.
So which non-Buddhist view is it? It's still the second non-Buddhist view that does speak of liberation. They are now giving another alternative of how to attain liberation.
카가 가리시고 그랬으려나 차과를 님이 따야다 풍보를 끼운 따야 디치부 마이바 셴바시고.
So what they are saying here is that there is another alternative that is neither thinking of the defects of the self, of the attachment, nor is it thinking of the defects or the faults of mind, things that belong to the self.
So that 디 가리레스라나 시바 랑신의 기부 타데도 셰바 트람도 미테바 슬라디 랑신의 기부 타데도 셰바 디 트람인스 랍기요 디 랍기요 바인도 디 미테바 디 테바 디 까용데 디 미테바네스.
So the fourth subdivision here is the inaccuracy of the knowledge of person and nature being different as a path for liberation. So what they're saying is knowing that person and nature are different is the path to liberation. Here, Acharya Dharmakirti is refuting that. Please also pay attention, person and nature have very different meanings in English from what they're saying.
다 디 랍겐 디 수레스 랍나 장젠 바체 디 인두 장젠 바 나레스 왕소 다기와라 착비 균이 다 시리기 기부당 왕소게 랑신 찍두 셴바디 임베스 디니 된신도 셰바 트람이노 셰나스.
So the ones who profess this view are the Sankhyas, and so the commentary says the Samkhya say the cause of attachment to the faculties and so on that belong to the self is conceiving of the nature of a person that is a knowing and aware self. So here how they qualify person is a knowing and aware self, that all goes together. Yeah, person that is a knowing and aware self, and the nature of the faculties and so on as one, which is why the path to liberation is knowing the two to be distinct.
다 코란 속에 다 세디 다 라에 다 델라 콘족이 명다 용도 다 시리기 기부 슬랍기. So 다 시리기 기부 라윤데 다디 유시기 요와 손사 셰바레 유리기 요와 손사 리거레. 이나 단단 가서 남보상이 슝 가장 가서 스케지 셰데기 세시리과 세 남시에 세게지 딜랍기 요 말이. 딜레시기 요 말이.
So please pay attention here, because when they use the word self, they are talking about the self as a person that is knowing and aware. And they are, because the self knows things, it is knowing, and because it perceives things, it is aware. So they qualify the self as having these two qualities. They say it is a person that is knowing and aware. Maybe there's some other way of translating it in many philosophical texts I haven't checked. However, do keep in mind that here, when we say the nature of consciousness is to be clear and knowing, it's very different from how they are speaking of knowing and being aware.
셰바기 유셰바다 셰바기 유리과체 다기 유셰바다 다기 유리고 디직바르와.
So the fact that consciousness is knowing and aware, actually, the fact that consciousness knows and the fact that consciousness is aware, in as much as it is knowing and aware, is similar to the person as well.
와. 당한주 셰바스네 넘버 셰바스 남시에서 가지고 계제 셰디 남시에서 여러와. 텔라 다스 콘조 라기요 말에. 텔라 다스 말라바체. 그와. 소자 다스에디 셰바도 찍고 찍산 셰지 유셰바도 유리고 누바 여바시. 유셰바도 유리고 여바 칠레 여바 찍라. 이나 양코 남시인 슬랍기요. 다디 남시레 슬랍기요 말에.
되게 남시기 타니 인진을 백교 가우쇼.
다 간다 가지고 디 낭베 슝니 셰데 가지고 셰바 세시리고세 딜 셰바디 레시고.
So here this is just not there in English, huh? It's just not there. You know how it's not there. I don't know how to explain this to you. It's not there. When we say consciousness, what we're actually translating is namshe from Tibetan or vijnana from Sanskrit. Okay? When they are talking about consciousness, they are not talking about namshe. It's almost as if literally consciousness is translating an aspect knower. Okay? Literally. Or vijnana is like it has a discriminative quality. It has a quality of discrimination. In English, we translate both as consciousness. So this doesn't work in English at all. Okay? So I don't know what you want to do. So you're going to have to figure this out. But basically, what the Buddhists are calling consciousness is actually namshe. Right? Which is the fifth aggregate. Is that fine? It's the fifth aggregate of consciousness. And that's actually translating vijnana and namshe, which has a connotation of some level of discrimination. Here, what they are calling the self, having the nature of consciousness, is not that. It's this other form of consciousness that is just knowing and aware. So even though the properties of knowing and aware, of knowing things and being aware, are common to both, what the Buddhists call consciousness is not the quality that they're ascribing to the self when they say it's conscious. Is that okay? I don't know how you're going to deal with this. Just Sheba. Again, namshe tan Quran zu ngazur nangbe shung nala namshe she de dan khonzo gi sheba she de dila Quran chile gi thone mindawa chik sheba ro ba khandir.
Khonzo gi dila shiri gi kibus lao ma do tan namshe ins lab gi yomar. Sheba namshe di ins lab gi yomar.
So they're not even saying it's consciousness, they're saying it is conscious. Maybe that's the best way to go with it. Right? Don't give it a noun, just give it the function of being conscious. While they're saying the self is conscious, they're not saying that it is consciousness. Make that distinction maybe in English. Yeah, that might work, okay? It's conscious, but it's not consciousness. Let's try and go with that for now.
Ta yu shes lana chawa, yu shebas lana chawa. Ya shebas lana shebi chawa yu dikengi se shiri wadela shebas ningazo ya di mingi ton geje she ni duwa. Ta tanda khonzo de da shiri gi gibus la yu di shiri la di mingi ton geje ma imbache chawa yorda dagi yu shigi yorpena nge sheson nge tongson slagi yoso dala yu sheba yore dagi yu tongwa yore yu rigwa yoba yendu da senge di yu sheken yu riken dindigi gibujire es da laporwa.
So yeah, I think this is the best way that we can do this. When you say knowing, you're talking about an action, right? It's a verb, to know. Then when you say knower, you end up with a noun. You're talking about that agent. When we use the word consciousness, we say consciousness knows, but when you say consciousness, you're referring to the agent. You're referring to a noun. It's a noun. We say the thing that knows is consciousness, and so the noun that we ascribe the quality of knowing to is consciousness. They are ascribing the quality of knowing not to consciousness but to the person, because the person knows, the person experiences. So we'll just call it knowing, and the agent of that knowing, instead of saying it's consciousness, is person. Yeah? So that entire thing before, you can actually forget all of that and just consider it like this. Okay?
Da henge duslan ron kasero tangba inarta. Nge tanda lakola bagbegal modi du shayin di keran soyge modi shegi duwa. So da keran sola mo shebe mo shegen di kajudu ngobo kajuduslan mo shegen kajuduslan tiwatana.
So to make it clear, if you're all looking at this cup and I ask you, do you know this cup? Right? J. Do you know this cup? Huh? Do you know what the cup is? Okay. How many things are there that know this cup? What is that?
The self.
No. Does your consciousness know this cup? Yes. Is there a mind that knows this as well? So what knows it? So the mind has no work then. No, not what they're saying. What do you think? Just to make this clear to all of you. Yeah. What do we feel? Like when you feel that you know something, do you feel that there's, what do you think is knowing the thing? So would you say your mind sees this?
Yes, and
then would you also say you see this?
so the tongking need
So there's two seers, if you will, right?
One
One is the person and one is the mind.
Ta tongking sheba di dan tongking nga nyubudi chik ribe ni kaga yores.
So then are there those two things that see it, are they one thing or are they two distinct things?
그래서 소장 니요레스 통경이 나직당 통경이 쉐바직 카가 니요레스 다조 이기 쉐바가 나나다 통경 이기 쉐바 되다 디리긴기 이기 쉐바 되다 디 통경이 나니디 지금말에 카가레스 제기 통이 카가레스 계지싱이디 단다 치루버디시
The view or the idea that there are two distinct things, and now when you're talking about consciousness, you're talking about, or the mind, you're talking about mental consciousness, okay? There is a distinct mental consciousness that knows, and then there is a distinct person that knows. There are two distinct knowers, is the view of the Sankhya over here. Yeah, there's two distinct knowers.
그래서 다 남고상계 베체나 이기 남시 대가랑 강사레마도 아니 네 통송생이 나디 이기 남시 대가랑 깨지셔야레마도 카가케요 말했다.
The Buddhist view, however, or the Buddhist explanation of this is only mental consciousness knows it. I am not other than this mental consciousness. I am that thing itself. So there are no two distinct things that know. It's one thing.
소자 모디 리hinge 모디 일 지hinge 이기 넘버 셔바체 델 제신도 규르바 아니 모디 일 지hinge 강사지 깨제 셔바이나 딘디디 풍불이 된심이 강사하세 디레.
So this person that is distinct and knows things is a person that is, so when you're reading person here in this section, it's referring to that person that has this quality of being a knower and is aware and is distinct or separate from aggregates. Yeah, is that clear? So for the purpose of this section, that's what person is.
손자 다디 인디 남바상게 버체나 셰 유셰바다 유리과다 가리 깨제 셰바 있나야? 리킨디 제 파케제 셰가 제디 파 대가 침바 있나? 넘버 셰바 코란레마도 셰바 제 셰바 요마레.
So according to the Buddhists, whatever verb or action you might be talking of, whether it is knowing, being aware, realizing, all of these actions, when you look for what the substance is that is doing all of these actions, you're only going to find consciousness. There's no separate substance that is doing these things.
So that chiruba 단다 따왔음딩이 chiruba 디기 아니 셰킨 셰바 리과 일라 쳬바서 파도스파 대침바이나 디나로라 셰바 직다 셰바 마잉의 강사직 니도 우시고.
Whereas here, the non-Buddhists, when they say the function or the action of knowing, being aware, realizing, etc., the one that does this, when you look for that substance, you'll find two separate things. One is consciousness and one is the person.
디 인디다 유셰바다 유직과디 셰바치구기 첼레 말에 달라인 디 첼레디 요르다.
Which is why then this function here, that is knowing and being aware, is not unique only to consciousness, it's even a property of the self.
디 균쟁게 아니 다들 가리세고레 다 시리기 기부스 밍타 콘조기.
Which is why they call the self a person that is knowing and aware. Is that okay now?
다 콘조기 다 시리기 기부 랍기 요데 응안저기 삼로 땅땅디 알레 콘조기 다 셰바 킬링기도 왔을 응안저기 삼로도 땅바이나 노바.
That's why now if you think, oh, when they're saying it is a person that is knowing and aware, they are essentially talking about consciousness. That's wrong. Okay?
소자 셰바 달라 켈리안디 낭바레 아니 셰바 달라 켈리안바디 낭비 투모마이 바차도 그래 소자 디인디 콘조기 다시리기 지부 랍샤바 디기 코란조기 셰바 달라 켈링기도 somebody 투규메.
Because if you recollect, the position that the self is just the mind or consciousness is a unique, it's only the Buddhist position, right? So if you feel that they are also saying the same thing, then there's room for getting confused between these two things. So make sure you just don't get confused, okay?
디차소마 다세 게제 디차소마 다 딘디기 다 대당 다 시리기 기부 대당 왕소 슬라 다 왕소 세 속다디 나로라 왕보라 속바 왕보체 대가나 신기 풍부 제주 상마께지 시기요.
So then that's self. And then the nature of the faculties and so on, within the faculties and so on, we have the same. Whatever are the faculties, the body, the aggregates.
So the 인데다 기부기 랑신 대다 아니 왕보라 속배 아니 풍보된 쪽이 랑신이부 다 간다 다다 된다도 고대고 제바이나 다다 풍분이기 랑신이부디 벳카가레스.
So where it says conceiving of the nature of person and the nature of faculties is saying that conceiving of them as one is the problem, conceiving of the nature of the person and conceiving of the nature of the faculties is seeing them as one is the problem, which another way of just basically saying this in an easier way is saying that the nature of the self and seeing that the nature of the aggregates is one is the problem, and what actually is the reality of the situation or how things really exist is that the nature of the person or the nature of the self and the nature of the aggregates is distinct. So that's what they're saying. They're two distinct things.
So that 다다 풍분이기 랑신 벳카가 여대버 찍라 ngaran suegi kaga yobad mashebache tulne dada pungbuni rangshin chigdu ngazogi shendigi yores.
So to further kind of clarify their view, what they're saying is the nature of the self and the nature of the aggregates is actually distinct. They're two distinct things. But because we are mistaken, we conceive of them as one. So our conception, our way of conceiving the self and the aggregates is seeing them as being of one nature. And seeing them as being of one nature is the problem. That happens through error because actually they are distinct. They have distinct natures.
Pena ngobu chigla mingni ta shaba soroshi. ngobuchila mingmindawa ni ta shabache ina pa tsega droyende ngobuchigmado yomare so mingmindawa ni ta shadu hop kalanga ju sambala ngobudi ni yebe soros ngadu samlo khogurwa ina pa tsega droyende ngobuchigmado meba ina chigchadi gorwa o dinashin cheje dinashin sheba ina kharcharode ngobudi chigimbache 된라 ngobudi chigimbache la mingkhaga ta shadu ngazola ngobu mindawa ni yonang ngazola chigshargirwa odiche chigdiche.
For instance, if you have one thing but you give two different names to the same thing, then even though it might have two different names, when you think of it, you're thinking of two separate things, but what it boils down to is that it's just one thing. So the fact that we generally have this idea that there's separate things is often because they're just different names, but that does not mean that the substance itself is two separate things. Similarly, it also is possible to consider two things being the same, two different things being the same, because they have the same name. So when you qualify things in one category or giving them the same name, there's also this room for error of considering those two things being the same.
Sonza shebala yu sheba the yu rigba gi geje share yore dala yu sheba the yu rigba di geje share yodi denla sheba da dani di khagare de niga la tumungi sheba the rigba se geje de share yoba yindi kuni chigdu nganzola tunang de ligi yores.
And so because it's possible to take two distinct things but find that they have some shared qualities and therefore mistake them to be one thing, consciousness has the function of knowing and being aware. The self also has the function of being knowing and aware. And because these functions are common to both, this leads to the error that they are the same thing, or believing that they're of one nature.
Pena ngazo shungi nalola nyachil nguldu chuba seje 냐기 빠고서로 직 가르쳐 어디 뮤기 도라고 슈지 여바인데 아니 디 텔라 뮤기 카도도 고 찬라와디 여바인데 디 김쟁기 콜 추시게제 물레도 사망아도 로케더와 우디나시.
For instance, in the text you find this example of mistaking fish to be silver, because if you have fish skin, it's glistening and it's silver. When you see that similar property that it shares with silver of being glistening and silver colored, you mistake it to be silver. So you assume that a fish is silver because of seeing that shared property. In that same way, when you see a shared property, it's easy to mistake those two things to be one. That's what they're saying.
소자 다 치료바디 가르라고라나 낭바든 주 추되샤시.
So what they're saying is all the Buddhists here have fallen prey to this error.
남시 다이 라디아디 추되샤스.
So they're saying all you Buddhists who think consciousness is the self, you're all mistaken.
가르질라나 쿠란이가라 칠레 유시바도 유리고 차다와도 유디 단 남시랑 다인사레 삼지 추시디레스. 두모와 칠레 여바디.
Which is why they're saying over here that you Buddhists, seeing that the self and consciousness have these qualities of knowing and being aware, you're making this error of assuming that they're the same thing or that they're of one nature. That's your mistake. It's wrong.
다 딩이 찍도 통화도 찍도 셴바디 아니 코로바 코지기 규이 싸와 착백이 규리다. 착백이 규티레스.
And on top of that, they're also saying, seeing this or conceiving of the person and consciousness to be of one nature or being the same is the cause of samsara, because it is the cause of attachment.
디인디 맞아 코발라 코딩이 창맥이 나다 풍부 찍도 통 찍도 셴바게 되기.
And so, which is why all of us who are in samsara are all in it because we are mistakenly seeing consciousness and the self to be one.
So that 낭바점 많이 뭐 코어 코딩이 창마르다. 코어 코딩이 착박게 되는 창마 나 본부 찍도 셴이 착박게 돼.
So this is, they're not just saying this is like only Buddhists are mistaken. They're saying anyone who is a slave to craving or is in samsara, all of them, the reason why they're in it is because they conceive of the self and consciousness to be one.
So that 낭바에 디나로 추기 여봐. 선자 낭바 코로바레스. 다 낭바를 다좀바 착발을 제와디 시기 마레스.
And because
타바 시기 마레스. 어디라고 다.
And because Buddhists fall within the category of people who see things as, see consciousness and the self as the same, they are also within samsara. There's no freedom for samsara for Buddhists as well.
그래서 어디디 다시리기 기보도 왕속의 장신 찍도 셴바디 아니 코로코비 유 차바게 자와체 다 딩이 된신이 버셔서나 풍부기 장신의 다생의 카가이 버셔서나 아니 찍도 셴바디 빵도 그래 아니 탈바도 그래.
And so that's why they're saying, when you realize that, so conceiving of the nature of the person and the nature of the faculties and so on as one is the cause of samsara, when you realize that they are distinct, they are separate entities, then that realization is what's going to be the path that leads to liberation. So, which is why the path to liberation is knowing the two to be distinct.
So that 당지 다 가르쳐 그래. 다 달라 차비 착와스 계제 쉐인데 다 가야 계제자는 마셔 버체. 다 가야 계제 마셔다 알디 샤션 되겠다.
We stop here.
사이로지.